I'm starting to notice that there's recently been a trend that's going on with animated films. More and more, these movies seem to have this strong need to connect more with their origins and become what we refer to as cartoony. Beforehand, these types of films would only come once every few years. Nowadays, it's like half of all animated films released decided to step out of the norm from being like any other movie by going completely over the top and go whoop, 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 whoop. I'm not crazy. I'm sure you guys are noticing this too. The Hotel Transylvania films, Free Birds, Home, the Angry Birds movie, the recent Ice Age sequels, Storks, Trolls, The Boss Baby, the list goes on. I'm seeing these types of films come and go so often, but in the end, the only moment I've seen them get a time to shine was when they hit theaters, and that's it. I needed a moment to just sit and think about the entire situation. If these films can only have 15 minutes of fame, why do they keep making more of them? Overall, the big question I had to ask myself, why are animated films cartoony nowadays? Well, now that I figured out an answer, let's find out. Now, the first thing that I want to do is that I will be taking all those films and put them in a category of cartoony movies. Now, you might be sitting there and wonder, if that's the case, why can't you just call them animated films? It's like the same, right? Wrong. There is actually a clear distinction between an animated film and a cartoony movie. An animated film's goal is to be a feature film where the main focus is on the script. They would put in emphasis on the development of the story and characters in order to be compared to other feature films. A cartoony movie's goal, however, is to not be a movie, but rather a cartoon where its main focus lies on the humor. They would put more emphasis on the gags and the execution on the animation in order to be compared with other cartoons like the Looney Tunes or the Silly Symphonies. You get the picture? I would like to mention though that there is a special category that fits in between. Some movies like the Despicable Me films, The Emperor's New Groove, and the Madagascar films could be considered a cartoony movie with both their art style and how they try to be more funny, but they're still aware of the importance of story and character that they can still count as an animated film. Those movies would fit in the category of animated comedies. You still get a movie out of it, but you'll get a lot more laughs than with a regular animated film. So now that we've clarified what a cartoony movie is, I might as well jump into the big question. Maybe you won't believe me when I say this, but using computer animation in order to make feature films is still a relatively young technique. I mean, Toy Story turned 20 years old not too long ago. People are still experimenting with what the technology can do in order to create the art. To quote John Lasseter, the art challenges technology and the technology inspires the art. After spending some time with it and manipulating ways in order to perfect their craft to create beautiful 3D worlds, artists have a need to challenge themselves and try something new. Movies like Shrek and Finding Nemo have already tried to bring computer animation in a more realistic front. But now they want to see if they can bring the medium to another direction. In fact, why don't we go back to animation's roots and just flat out make a cartoon? You know, make a 3D version of something from the 30s or the 40s, you know, like 1930s and 40s. And thus came the cartoony movie, where the source of inspiration would be less from either Walt Disney or Hayao Miyazaki, and more from people like Tex Avery or John Kricfalusi. This is why they would go and hire more non-conventional directors whose backgrounds are more linked into the animation process than it is with the story. In some cases, they would even bring in people with no experience in working on theatrical animated films to take the lead. The result that would come to them, whoo boy, it can really be all over the place. Much like the tone of these films, funny enough. On average, critics are not usually fond of these cartoony movies, with ratings that can range from decent at best to just plain bad. The reason why they barely get any great reviews is because, like I've already established, they don't want to be movies that tell a story. They want to be a cartoon that can make you laugh. When you look at them as a movie, they do seem to be rather weak, since less care was put onto the story and crafting the characters throughout the feature. Sure, they can get away from negative reviews if they do a good job on the animation, and if they make sure that the jokes are funny, but at best they'll end up with a rating of 6, maybe 7 out of 10? In many cases, that's not going to be enough to encourage people to go see the film. That's ultimately why they have to be much more dependent on word of mouth in terms of their marketing, especially if they're from a studio that doesn't have a legacy in the levels of Disney, or have a big name in charge of the movie. Even when it comes to the audience, the reactions can be very mixed, and no two people would like the exact same cartoony movie. Some would prefer Storks, others would prefer the Angry Birds movie. Some like Trolls, others like The Boss Baby. Even in the range of how people like it or not can be everywhere from not caring much to extreme emotions about it. However, as a film critic, I can explain to you very well why no craps are usually given to these cartoony movies. Because they're not trying to be movies! They rather want to be cartoons, and that's a problem because they can't escape what they actually are. Real cartoons are usually around 7 minutes long, but when they end up being 90 minutes, they become a feature film. No questions asked, and that's why they end up being judged as a movie. The problem with a film being a cartoon is that they put the focus in the wrong area. The filmmakers care more about the visuals than the script. Sure, the animation is like the body and it's important to make it look good, but the script is the heart of the project. And when your script doesn't have an engaging story, interesting concepts, and well thought out characters, it doesn't matter how good the animation is, your movie is still gonna suck. Anybody who has seen 8 Crazy Nights could tell you that. Also, many of these cartoony movies would unfortunately share a common trait that reflects a bit poorly on both who they want their target audience to be and their quality. I'm talking, of course, of how they want to be perceived as cool and hip. Oh, it's already bad enough when we got Alvin and the Chipmunks and the Smurfs trying to shove that down our throats. We don't need movies like Trolls blasting random remixed pop songs every 15 minutes and shout out modern slang like YOLO! As a movie, that doesn't make you cool. It makes you dated, and it alienates a good chunk of your audience since you'd rather want to connect with dumb kids that easily get suckered in on that stuff. In fact, Hotel Transylvania is another example of how it screwed itself up by using this tactic. When it was released in theaters, maybe audiences enjoyed the use of "I'm sexy and I know it" and having pop culture references like mentioning Twilight. But watching it nowadays, it doesn't have the same effect as it did before. Instead of trying to be timeless that people can enjoy for generations to come, it ends up holding up a big sign saying, "I am a movie from 2012. But let me tell ya, when an animated film is bad, it ends up being a bad movie. But when a cartoony movie doesn't even meet the standards of its peers, it would go from bad to worse. Movies like the Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs films and Norm of the North are already terrible with such bad writing and unbearable humor to the point that it's questionable if they were made by legitimate filmmakers. But when the animation is equally poorly executed, it becomes the salt to an open wound, where now it physically hurts to watch them. Those were the only films so far that I've ever experienced where I had to watch it without my glasses. Who knew that having imperfect vision can actually have its benefits? Now, I'm not saying that anything with a cartoony style is immediately in the category of a cartoony movie. An art style only applies to the animation and not necessarily on the script. So there are some animated films with cartoony animation. The best example I could point this out with is Pixar's Inside Out. The movie's animation is actually highly praised and can be considered far better than any of those cartoony movies because it actually has something that they don't. Can you guess what it is? Give up? It has a point to its art style in the context of the movie. When you look at something like Home or Penguins of Madagascar, the only reason people will tell you why they're cartoony is because, I don't know, it's because they're cartoons. But with Inside Out, however, the reason why that film can be cartoony is because it's all set in the mind of an 11-year-old girl, and it presents a contrast to how the world outside her mind is animated in a more realistic sense. That's what makes Inside Out an animated film. It highly values presenting the concept of a visual representation of what's inside the mind with an original story and great characters. Another example of an animated film with a cartoony style is Sausage Party. Instead of fully being a cartoon, despite the art style and the strong emphasis on the comedy, It wants to be an allegory of unity over religion. You see, this is what makes animated films superior to cartoony movies, because they can offer so much more. Let's be honest, almost every animated film nowadays can try to make people laugh. You're not going to impress much if the biggest selling point to your film is that it's funny. Both audiences and critics are looking for more in their movies, and those are the elements that will attract to them. Again, an animated film is like a person. The animation is like the physical appearance and will only describe what it looks like. But the script is like the heart, and that is what people will remember the most and what will truly identify the feature. But I do have a feeling that these cartoony movies might not last that long, actually. If you remember what I said in the very beginning of this, I mentioned that these cartoony movies are just a trend. When you look at the box office numbers of some of these films, you'll discover that many of them performed very poorly at the box office to the point of being considered a bomb. Sure, there are some that can actually turn a profit for the studios, and others can be an exception to this, like Minions and the Angry Birds movie, since they are only a product to a much bigger franchise. However, I can guarantee you that most, or even all of them, would end up having their entire legacy reside in that movie graveyard known as the $5 bin. As for the trend of cartoony movies itself, I have one major evidence that will prove that it will eventually end, and I am talking, of course, of Disney and Pixar. Okay, technically that counts as two, but they're doing the same thing, so that's why it counts as one. Unlike studios like Sony, DreamWorks, Blue Sky, and Warner Brothers, Disney and Pixar don't even bother making cartoony movies, and instead would rather continue doing their own thing that they've done for decades by making the script priority number one. The result has now gone to the point that they are making billion-dollar movies. Toy Story 3, Frozen, Zootopia, and Finding Dory have managed to achieve what was once considered impossible. Not a single cartoony movie would even manage to achieve half, or even a fraction of what these films can make. One day, it will come to the point that the studio executives will look at what Disney's been doing and have a desire to step up their own game so that they can actually compete, and that will be the moment when cartoony movies will die, because they will never make the same profits as Disney. Seriously, the only animation studio that's at Disney's level is Illumination, because even they know how to respect the script. That's it! But Animat, you say, isn't it better for the studios to be their own thing instead of copying Disney for money? I'm just saying, why else are all animated films musicals during the 90s? And why else do all animated features use computer animation since the new millennium? Kind of my point. What I'm trying to say is that trends always come and go, and so do these movies. At best, they only earn a short-term profit while they get their 15 minutes of fame in theaters, and then a few months later, poof! They disappear into obscurity because they fail to retain their audience in the long run. Listen, if you're gonna make a movie and you're not taking your job seriously, don't be surprised if nobody will take your movie seriously. Maybe you'll get a small group in the animation community that will admire the technicality of the visuals, but the most attention you'll actually get are gonna be from casual viewers. The ones who will watch it and say, I like it cause it's funny, and not even give it a second thought. What do you expect from these movies? A fan base that takes those things seriously? Ha! Yeah, sure. Good luck with that. Call me when you make an actual animated film. That's going to be the only time when people will care about your work. But again, doesn't really matter what I say about these movies. I mean, after all, they're just cartoons.
Let's give these people what they came 1,000 miles to see. A show!
Oh, that is the most disgusting thing I've ever seen!